The Aryan Brotherhood crashed a family dinner. They never imagined they wouldn't make it out alive. The Martinez family had learned to keep their heads down in Riverside, California. Diego Martinez, a former gang member who'd left that life behind 15 years ago, now ran a small auto repair shop on the east side of town. Martinez Auto Works, a modest garage with 2 bays and a faded sign that had seen better days. His wife, Carmen, worked the night shift at Riverside County Regional Medical Center, where she'd earned a reputation as one of the best trauma nurses in the ER. Their 2 children, Sophia, 17, and Miguel, 14, were good kids who stayed out of trouble, made decent grades, and had never given their parents a moment of worry that didn't come from the normal anxieties of teenage life. Diego had built this quiet life brick by brick, paying his debts to society and doing everything right. He'd served his time in Chino State Prison for armed robbery, a stupid mistake he'd made at 19, high on adrenaline and bad decisions. 5 years inside had shown him exactly what kind of man he didn't want to be. When he got out, he'd used his grandfather's inheritance to buy the garage, married Carmen, who'd waited for him despite her family's protests, and never looked back. But the past has a way of finding you, even when you've done everything, to bury it 6 feet deep and cover it with concrete. It was a Sunday evening in late September when the knock came, the kind of evening that makes Southern California worth all its problems. The air still held the dry heat of summer, but the worst of it had broken, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of jasmine from Carmen's carefully tended garden. The Martinez family sat around their modest dining table, a scarred oak piece Diego had refinished himself, passing plates of Carmen's homemade enchiladas, Spanish rice, and refried beans. Miguel was talking about his upcoming basketball tryouts at Riverside Poly High, his eyes bright with the kind of teenage enthusiasm that made Diego's heart ache with pride and protectiveness. Before we continue with what happened that night, if you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. Now, back to the Martinez family's dinner. Sophia scrolled through her phone between bites, smiling at something one of her friends had sent her, probably about the homecoming dance in 2 weeks. She'd been debating between 2 dresses, and Carmen had promised to take her shopping next weekend. Diego watched his family, feeling that rare sensation of complete contentment, the kind that makes you forget, just for a moment, that the world outside your 4 walls can be cruel and unforgiving. He reached for Carmen's hand under the table and squeezed it gently. She smiled at him, that same smile that had kept him sane during those long years in Chino. "Dad," Miguel said, spearing another enchilada, "Coach Martinez, no relation, said if I make the team, I could start as point guard." "Can you believe that? A freshman starting?" "I can believe it," Diego said, pride warming his voice. "You've been working hard, mijo. All those early morning practices paid off." "Speaking of which," Carmen interjected, "you need new shoes. Those ones you have are falling apart." "Mom, they're supposed to look like that. It's the style." "The style is broken soles and holes? In my day—" The knock cut her off. It wasn't polite. It was heavy, insistent, the kind that rattled the hinges and made the cheap brass knocker Diego had installed last spring clatter like chains. The sound seemed to suck all the warmth out of the room. Diego's fork froze halfway to his mouth, enchilada sauce dripping back onto his plate. Carmen's eyes met his across the table, and he saw the flash of fear she tried to hide, the same fear he'd seen in her eyes years ago when prison guards had led him away in shackles. "Stay here," Diego said quietly, pushing back from the table. His chair scraped against the linoleum floor with a sound that seemed too loud in the sudden silence. But before he could reach the door, before he could even cross the 5 steps from the dining table to the entryway, it burst open. The cheap lock he'd been meaning to replace for months splintered with a crack that echoed through the small house like a gunshot. Wood fragments scattered across the floor, and the door slammed against the wall, hard enough to dent the drywall. 3 men stepped inside, and Diego's blood went cold. He recognized the tattoos immediately, the shamrocks inked in faded blue-green, the lightning bolts that marked them as brothers, the coded numbers across their necks and knuckles that told stories of violence and allegiance. Aryan Brotherhood. The leader was a massive man named Kyle Decker, someone Diego had known briefly during his time in Chino 20 years ago. They'd never been friends. Diego had kept to himself, done his time quietly, stayed out of prison politics as much as possible. But you remembered men like Decker. You couldn't forget them even if you tried. Decker's shaved head gleamed with sweat in the warm evening air. His neck was thick with muscle and scar tissue, and a fresh tattoo, a swastika surrounded by lightning bolts, crawled up from his collar. His pale blue eyes, the color of winter ice, swept the room with predatory calculation, taking in every detail. The family dinner, the modest furnishings, the crucifix Carmen's mother had given them hanging above the doorway to the kitchen, the photographs of Sofia and Miguel on the wall, tracking their growth from babies to the teenagers they were now. "Well, well," Decker said, his voice carrying that particular mix of casual menace and barely controlled violence that Diego remembered too well from his prison days. "Diego Martinez, thought you could just disappear, huh? Thought you could play house and we'd forget all about you?" Diego positioned himself between the men and his family, his hands raised in a placating gesture, even as his mind raced through possibilities and found none that ended well. "Get out of my house," he said, keeping his voice steady. "I'm not part of that world anymore. I did my time, I paid my debt, and I walked away clean. You've got no business here." Decker laughed, and the sound was like rocks grinding together. The 2 men flanking him joined in, one tall and skeletal with a spiderweb tattoo covering the left side of his face, prison-done and crude, the other shorter but thick with the kind of muscle you only built in prison yards where weights and violence were the only entertainment. The skeletal man wore a sleeveless shirt that showed off arms covered in ink, including a prominent 666 on his right bicep. The muscular one had a fresh bruise on his jaw and knuckles scabbed over from recent fighting. "See, that's where you're wrong, Diego," Decker said, taking a step closer. His boots, heavy black Doc Martens with steel toes, left prints on Carmen's carefully mopped floor. "You don't just leave. You especially don't leave after what you saw. The AB doesn't issue retirement papers, hermano. We're a family, and family is forever." Carmen stood up slowly, her nurse's training kicking in as she assessed the situation with the same clinical calm she used in the ER when trauma patients rolled in bleeding and screaming. She could see the bulges under their jackets, guns, maybe knives, definitely weapons. Her children were frozen in their chairs, Sophia's phone forgotten in her trembling hand, Miguel's face pale with fear. Carmen had seen violence before, had treated its victims, had held dying men's hands as they slipped away. But this was different. This was her home, her family, her children in danger. "Please," Carmen said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "We have children here. Whatever this is about, whatever Diego did or didn't do, we can talk about it outside. Let me take my kids out of here first." Shut up," the skeletal man said, his voice high-pitched and wrong, like fingernails on a chalkboard. He pulled out a Glock 19 from his waistband and pointed it casually at the family, his finger resting too close to the trigger for anyone's comfort. "Nobody asked you nothing. Nobody goes nowhere." Diego's mind raced back 20 years to a hot afternoon in the laundry room at Chino State Prison. He'd been folding sheets, trying to stay invisible, trying to do his time without making enemies or joining any of the various gangs that ran the prison. But sometimes you couldn't avoid seeing things. An Aryan Brotherhood member named Tommy Vixen had cornered another inmate, a man named Marcus Williams, who owed money for protection he couldn't pay. And Diego had watched from behind a rolling cart of clean linens as Vixen drove a sharpened toothbrush into Williams's neck again and again. The blood had been everywhere, steaming on the concrete floor, and Williams had died choking on his own blood before the guards arrived. Diego had been questioned, of course. Everyone in that laundry room had been questioned. But Diego had done what you do in prison. He'd kept his mouth shut, said he didn't see nothing, just heard screaming and hit the floor. The guards had known he was lying, but without his testimony, they couldn't make a case stick. Vixen had gotten 6 months in the hole and came out with his reputation enhanced. Diego had finished his sentence and walked out those gates thinking he'd left it all behind. "I never said anything," Diego said now, his hands still raised. "I did my time, kept my mouth shut, and left. That's the code. I followed the code." "The code," Decker repeated mockingly, drawing out the word. He walked closer, his presence filling the small dining room, making it feel cramped and airless. "The code says you don't forget your brothers. The code says you don't turn your back on the family, but you did, didn't you? You went straight, got yourself a nice little life here." He gestured around the modest home with disgust, his lip curling. "Playing house with your Mexican family while we're still in the trenches, still fighting for our race." Diego's jaw tightened, anger flaring beneath his fear. "I'm not Mexican. I was born in this country, same as you. My family's been in California for 5 generations. "Details," Decker said with a shrug of his massive shoulders. "Point is, we've got a situation. Some people on the inside are talking about old cases getting reopened. Cold cases, they call them. That murder you witnessed. Tommy Vixen and Marcus Williams, remember them? Cops are sniffing around again. New DA, some ambitious woman who wants to make a name for herself cleaning up old prison murders. And we need to make sure certain witnesses don't suddenly develop a conscience. I told you, I never said anything. I'm not going to. I just want to live my life." "I know you're not," Decker said, and pulled out his own gun, a heavy .45 caliber pistol that looked like an extension of his scarred hand. "Because dead men don't talk, and neither do their families." The room erupted into chaos. Carmen screamed and threw herself over her children, pulling them down beneath the table in a tangle of limbs and overturned chairs. Plates crashed to the floor, enchiladas and rice scattering across the linoleum. Diego lunged forward, not at Decker, but at the skeletal man, knowing he was the most immediate threat with his gun already drawn and that twitchy finger too close to the trigger. Years of working with his hands, lifting engines and crawling under cars had kept Diego strong, despite his 45 years. He caught the man's wrist and twisted hard, using his body weight and momentum. He heard bone crack, with a sound like a green branch breaking, and the man screamed, a high-pitched shriek that hurt Diego's ears. The Glock clattered to the floor, spinning across the linoleum and coming to rest against the baseboard. But the muscular man was on Diego in seconds, driving a fist into his kidney that sent lightning bolts of pain through his body. Diego's legs buckled, and he went down hard, his knee cracking against the floor. Boots started raining down on him. 1, 2, 3 kicks that drove the air from his lungs. He curled up instinctively, trying to protect his head and organs, tasting blood in his mouth where he'd bitten his tongue. "Stop it!" Miguel screamed from under the table. "Leave my dad alone!" Shut that kid up," Decker ordered. But Carmen was already there, covering Miguel's mouth with her hand, holding both her children against her as they trembled. Through the pain and the ringing in his ears, Diego managed to look up. He saw his wife's face, saw the terror in her eyes, and something inside him shifted. He'd spent 15 years being a good man, playing by the rules, trying to make up for his mistakes. But these men had come into his home, threatened his family, and no amount of trying to do right would matter if he couldn't protect the people he loved. Diego's hand found the leg of an overturned chair. His fingers closed around it just as the muscular man pulled his foot back for another kick. Diego swung the chair leg with everything he had left, catching the man across the shin. The man howled and stumbled back, and Diego used the moment to scramble to his feet, his body screaming in protest. "Enough!" Carmen's voice cut through the chaos like a knife. Diego turned and saw something that made his heart stop. His wife was standing, and in her hands was the Glock the skeletal man had dropped. She held it with both hands, arms extended, pointed directly at Decker's chest. Her hands were steady. Years of dealing with trauma in the emergency room had given her nerves of steel. She'd seen too much death, too much violence to be easily shaken. "Get away from him, now!" Decker turned slowly, his .45 still in his hand, but pointed at the floor. He evaluated Carmen with those cold blue eyes, and a smile played at the corner of his mouth. "You even know how to use that, sweetheart." "I'm an ER nurse in Riverside," Carmen said coldly, her voice flat and emotionless in a way Diego had never heard before. "I've pulled more bullets out of bodies than you've probably fired. I know exactly where to aim to kill you instantly, and I know exactly where to aim to make you suffer for hours before you bleed out. The question isn't whether I know how to use it. The question is whether you want to find out which option I choose." For a moment, the standoff held. The skeletal man clutched his broken wrist, whimpering and rocking back and forth, tears streaming down his face. The muscular man stood over Diego, fists still clenched, his shin already swelling where the chair leg had connected. Decker stared at Carmen with those cold blue eyes, calculating odds, weighing his options. Then he smiled, a terrible, knowing smile that showed teeth yellowed by years of prison coffee and cigarettes. "You won't shoot," he said confidently. "Not in front of your kids, not with them watching. You're not a killer, and you know it. You're a nurse. You save lives, you don't take them." He was right, and they both knew it. Carmen's finger rested on the trigger, but Decker could see the hesitation in her eyes, could see her struggling with the weight of what pulling that trigger would mean. She'd taken an oath to do no harm, and even now, even with her family in danger, that oath warred with her survival instinct. But what Decker didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Sophia had quietly retrieved her father's cell phone from his pocket when Carmen drew the gun. The girl's hands shook as she dialed 911, but her voice was steady as she whispered their address to the dispatcher. "3 men broke into our house," she said, her words barely audible but clear. "They have guns. My mom has a gun pointed at them. Please hurry. 356 Magnolia Street. Please." The mistake the Aryan Brotherhood made that night wasn't just underestimating the Martinez family's will to survive. It was assuming they were alone, that the family had no one who'd come running if they needed help. Diego had left gang life, but he hadn't left it without making allies along the way. His neighbor, Marcus Johnson, was a retired Marine who'd done 3 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq before coming home to Riverside with a chest full of medals and a head full of nightmares he managed with therapy and woodworking. Marcus had been in his garage, working on a rocking chair for his first grandchild, when he'd heard the crash of Diego's door being kicked in. He'd heard the shouting, heard Carmen's scream, and his combat training had kicked in immediately. He didn't call the cops first, there wasn't time for that. Instead, he'd grabbed the aluminum baseball bat his son had left behind when he moved to San Diego, and he'd moved toward the Martinez house with the same focused intensity he'd used clearing houses in Fallujah. The front window shattered as Marcus came through it in an explosion of glass and wood frame. He didn't come through the door. That was what they'd expect. Instead, he crashed through the living room window, the baseball bat held high, broken glass catching the light as it scattered through the air. The muscular man turned toward the sound, his mouth opening in surprise, and caught the bat across his jaw. The impact made a sound like a watermelon hitting pavement, and the man dropped like a sack of cement, unconscious before he hit the floor. The skeletal man, still cradling his broken wrist, tried to reach for the fallen Glock with his good hand. But Miguel, terrified but brave in the way that only children protecting their parents can be, kicked it away. The gun skittered across the floor and under the refrigerator, out of reach. Sophia kept whispering into the phone, giving the dispatcher every detail she could see, her voice remarkably calm, given the chaos surrounding her. Decker spun toward Marcus, raising his .145, but Carmen fired first. The shot was deafening in the small house, so loud it left everyone's ears ringing. The bullet caught Decker in the shoulder, spinning him around. His gun went off, the bullet punching harmlessly into the wall, destroying a framed photo of Diego and Carmen on their wedding day. Plaster and glass rained down, and Decker roared in pain and rage, his face contorted. Marcus was on him before he could recover, driving the bat into Decker's wrist with surgical precision. The .45 fell from Decker's nerveless fingers, and he crumpled against the wall, clutching his shoulder where blood was already soaking through his shirt and jacket. The wound wasn't fatal. Carmen had aimed carefully, hitting muscle and bone but missing the major arteries, but it hurt like hell, and Decker's face had gone pale with shock. "You're all dead," he screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "All of you. The AB doesn't forget. We'll find you. We'll hunt you down. We'll kill everyone you've ever loved." "Neither do Marines," Marcus said grimly, keeping the bat raised, his stance perfect, ready to strike again if needed. "And I've got brothers too, asshole. Brothers who actually know what honor means." Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. The skeletal man tried to run, staggering toward the broken door, cradling his broken wrist and whimpering with every step. But he only made it as far as the front yard, before his legs gave out from shock and pain. He collapsed on Carmen's carefully maintained lawn, crushing her marigolds, and lay there sobbing. The muscular man was still unconscious on the floor, his breathing labored, blood trickling from his mouth where the bat had shattered several teeth and cracked his jaw. Decker sat against the wall, bleeding from his shoulder, his face twisted with hate and disbelief, and the dawning realization that he'd miscalculated badly. Diego pulled himself up, every muscle screaming in protest. His ribs felt cracked, maybe broken, and blood dripped from a cut above his eye. But he was alive, and more importantly, his family was alive. Carmen and the kids rushed to him, and they held each other tight, shaking with adrenaline and relief and delayed fear. Marcus stood guard at the door, bat still ready, until the first police car screeched to a stop outside, its lights painting the neighborhood in alternating red and blue. What followed was a blur that Diego would later struggle to remember clearly. Paramedics flooded into the house, their voices professional and calm as they assessed injuries. 2 of them went to work on Decker, packing the gunshot wound and starting an IV. Another checked the unconscious man's vital signs and called for a second ambulance. The skeletal man was treated on the lawn, his wrist splintered, his protests and threats ignored by the EMT, wrapping his arm. Diego was led outside to sit on the back of an ambulance, while a young paramedic, couldn't have been more than 25, cleaned his cuts and checked for broken ribs with gentle, probing fingers. Each touch sent fresh waves of pain through Diego's body, but he barely noticed. He was watching his family being interviewed by police officers, saw Carmen's steady composure finally crack as she broke down sobbing in a female officer's arms. Sophia held Miguel, both of them wrapped in shock blankets despite the warm night. their eyes wide and traumatized. The neighborhood had come alive. Lights were on in every house on the block. Neighbors gathered on the street, drawn by the commotion, speaking in hushed voices and pointing. Diego saw Mrs. Chen from 2 houses down, still in her bathrobe, her hand over her mouth in shock. He saw the Rodriguez family, all 7 of them, standing in a cluster, the younger kids wide-eyed with excitement at the drama, while their parents looked worried. Everyone in this neighborhood knew Diego had a past, but he'd earned their respect through 15 years of being a good neighbor, of helping fix cars for free when money was tight, of coaching Little League and organizing block parties. Detective Sarah Chen, no relation to Mrs. Chen down the street, arrived 30 minutes after the first patrol cars. She was a veteran of Riverside's gang unit, a compact woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She'd seen everything in her 20 years on the force, and very little surprised her anymore. But as she surveyed the scene, the broken window, the kicked-in door, the blood on the floor, the Aryan Brotherhood members being loaded into ambulances, even she looked impressed. She sat down beside Diego on the ambulance bumper, pulling out a worn notebook. "You want to tell me what this was really about?" she asked. Her voice was professional but not unkind. She'd read Diego's file in the car on the way over, knew about his past, his time in Chino, his clean record since release. Diego was quiet for a long moment, watching the EMTs wheel Decker past on a gurney. Their eyes met, and in that look, Diego saw a promise. This wasn't over. The AB would come for him again. They'd never stop. But Diego was tired of running. Tired of looking over his shoulder, tired of letting his past dictate his future. So he told Detective Chen everything. He told her about that hot afternoon in the prison laundry room 20 years ago, about watching Tommy Vixen murder Marcus Williams with a sharpened toothbrush, about the blood and the screaming and the guards arriving too late. He told her about the questioning afterward, about keeping his mouth shut because that was what you did in prison if you wanted to survive. He told her about carrying that secret for 2 decades, about trying to forget, about building a life and hoping the past would stay buried. "I just wanted to live a normal life," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "That's all I wanted. A normal life for me and my family." Detective Chen was quiet for a moment, writing in her notebook. Then she looked up at him, her expression serious. "You're going to have to testify now," she said. "You understand that? With what happened here tonight, with Decker's threats on record, with 3 AB members facing attempted murder charges, you're a key witness in multiple cases. The DA will want your testimony about the Williams murder, and the defense attorneys will try to tear you apart. We can offer protection, witness relocation if necessary, but your life is going to change significantly." Diego looked at his family again. Sophia had found a blanket for her mother. Miguel was talking to Marcus, probably thanking him, his young face animated despite the trauma. Carmen caught his eye and gave him a small, tired smile that said everything. "We'll get through this. We're together. That's what matters." "Yeah," Diego said finally. "I understand." The Aryan Brotherhood members were loaded into separate ambulances, handcuffed to their gurneys, even as the paramedics worked to stabilize them. Decker stared at Diego as they wheeled him past, and that look held a promise of violence, of revenge, of unfinished business. But Diego didn't look away. He'd spent years running from his past, trying to pretend it didn't exist, hoping that if he just lived quietly enough, it would leave him alone. Now it had crashed through his front door, threatened his family, and lost. Maybe it was time to stop running and start fighting back. As the ambulances pulled away, their sirens fading into the night, Detective Chen stood up. "For what it's worth, Mr. Martinez, you did the right thing tonight. You protected your family. That's what matters." Diego nodded, but he knew the real fight was just beginning. The AB didn't lose gracefully, and they had brothers on the outside who'd see tonight as a declaration of war. But as Carmen came over and took his hand, as his kids pressed close to him despite his injuries, Diego felt something he hadn't felt in years: resolve. He'd built a life worth protecting, and he was done running. The house was declared a crime scene, yellow tape cordoned off the front yard, and a forensics team arrived to document everything, taking photographs and measurements, collecting shell casings and blood samples. Diego and his family couldn't go back inside, not tonight. Maybe not for several days, while the investigation proceeded. Detective Chen arranged for them to stay at a nearby motel, and Marcus offered to drive them, his truck still parked in his driveway. As they gathered a few belongings from the front porch, the police allowed Carmen to grab some clothes and toiletries, Miguel's school books, Sophia's laptop. Diego's phone buzzed with a text. His boss at the garage, wondering if he was okay, saying he'd heard sirens. Then another from Carmen's supervisor at the hospital, offering help. Then another from Miguel's basketball coach. Then more. Neighbors, friends, people they'd known for years, all reaching out, all offering support. Marcus helped them load into his truck, and as they drove through the dark streets toward the motel Detective Chen had recommended, the old Marine spoke quietly. "You got people, Diego," he said, his eyes on the road. "This neighborhood, we look out for our own. Those AB bastards want a war, they'll get one, but not the kind they're expecting." Diego looked out the window at the familiar streets of Riverside, the liquor store where he bought his occasional beer, the park where he'd taught Miguel to ride a bike, the church where he and Carmen had renewed their vows on their 10th anniversary. This was his city, his neighborhood, his home, and he wasn't going to let hatred and violence take it from him. The motel was a cheap chain place off the highway, the kind with exterior doors and a flickering neon sign. But the room Detective Chen had arranged was clean enough, with 2 double beds and a small bathroom. Marcus helped them carry in their bags, then paused at the door. "You need anything, you call me," he said. "Day or night, doesn't matter. I'm 10 minutes away." "Marcus," Diego said, his voice thick with emotion, "thank you. You saved our lives." The old Marine shrugged uncomfortably. "Brothers, watch out for brothers. You'd have done the same for me." After Marcus left, Carmen made the room as homey as she could, arranging their few belongings and turning on the TV to a neutral channel, some home improvement show that none of them watched. Sophia and Miguel sat together on one bed, still processing what had happened. Diego sat on the other bed, every muscle in his body aching, and watched his family. "Are they going to come back?" Miguel asked finally, his voice small. "Those men." Diego wanted to lie, wanted to tell his son that everything would be fine, that the bad men were gone and wouldn't return. But he'd spent enough time in prison to know the truth. "They might try," he said honestly, "but we're not alone. We have the police, we have Marcus, we have this whole neighborhood that's got our backs, and we have each other." "I was so scared," Sophia said quietly. "When that man pointed the gun at us, I thought—" Her voice broke, and Carmen moved to sit beside her, wrapping her in a hug. "But you were brave," Carmen said firmly. "You called 911, you helped your brother, you kept your head. I'm so proud of you." "You shot that man," Miguel said to his mother, his eyes wide. "I didn't know you knew how to shoot a gun." Carmen sighed. "I don't, really. Your father took me to a shooting range once, years ago, after a woman was attacked in the hospital parking lot. I remember just enough to not shoot myself in the foot." She looked at Diego. "I aimed for his shoulder. I couldn't kill him, even after everything." "You saved our lives," Diego said simply. "That's all that matters." They talked late into the night, processing the trauma, asking questions, crying together, holding each other. Detective Chen had given them the number for a crisis counselor who specialized in trauma, and Carmen promised they'd all go to see her. The kids eventually fell asleep, exhausted by adrenaline crash and emotional overload, curled together on one bed, like they used to do when they were small. Diego and Carmen lay in the other bed, not sleeping, just holding hands in the darkness and listening to their children breathe. "What happens now?" Carmen whispered. "I testify," Diego said. "I tell the truth about what I saw 20 years ago. I helped put Tommy Vixen away for murder, and then maybe we can actually live without this hanging over us. They'll target you. The Aryan Brotherhood doesn't forget." "I know, but I'm tired of being scared. I'm tired of looking over my shoulder. And if I don't do this, what kind of example am I setting for Sofia and Miguel? That you run from your problems? That you stay silent in the face of evil?" Carmen was quiet for a long moment. Then she squeezed his hand. "We'll do it together. Whatever comes next, we face it together." And in that cheap motel room, with the sound of highway traffic outside and their children sleeping nearby, Diego felt something shift inside him. Fear was still there. He wasn't stupid, and he knew the road ahead would be dangerous. But underneath the fear was something stronger: determination, purpose. The resolve to finally make right something that had been wrong for too long. The next morning brought new challenges. Diego's body had stiffened overnight, every bruise and cut announcing its presence. Carmen drove to a nearby pharmacy to fill prescriptions for pain medication the emergency room doctor had given them. Sofia and Miguel were quiet, traumatized, jumping at every sound outside the motel room door. Diego called his boss at the garage, explaining the situation, and was told to take all the time he needed. The other mechanics would cover his shifts. Detective Chen called mid-morning. "I need you to come down to the station," she said. "The DA wants to talk to you about the Williams case, and we need your formal statement about last night." The police station was a modern building on the north side of Riverside, all glass and concrete and the smell of burnt coffee. Chen met them in the lobby and escorted them to a conference room where two other people waited: Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Wu, a sharp woman in her 30s with an armful of files, and FBI Special Agent Robert Miller, who explained that the Bureau had an ongoing investigation into the Aryan Brotherhood's activities in California prisons. The next 3 hours were exhausting. Diego recounted the murder he'd witnessed in detail, every moment, every word he could remember, every detail of Tommy Vixen's face and Marcus Williams' dying screams. He gave his statement about the home invasion, walking them through every moment, from the knock on the door to the final arrest. Carmen gave her statement. Even Sofia and Miguel were interviewed, gently but thoroughly, about what they'd seen and heard. "This is a significant case," Ada Wu said finally. "With your testimony, we can reopen the Williams murder investigation. Combined with some new forensic evidence our crime lab has developed using updated DNA testing, we have a strong case. But I need to be honest with you, Mr. Martinez. The defense will attack your credibility, your criminal record, the fact that you waited 20 years to come forward, your relationship with the victims and suspects. It won't be easy." "I understand," Diego said, "but it's the right thing to do." Agent Miller leaned forward. "The FBI will offer you witness protection if you want it. New identities, relocation, the whole package. You'd be safe." Diego looked at Carmen, at his kids, starting over somewhere new, with new names, new lives, leaving everything behind. It was tempting, but it also felt like letting the AB win, like running away instead of standing up. "Can I think about it?" he asked. "Of course, but don't take too long. Once word gets out that you're cooperating, things could move fast." They left the police station as the sun was setting, painting the California sky in shades of orange and pink. The motel felt claustrophobic after the long day, so Diego drove them to a park near the river, where they could walk and breathe and try to process everything. Sofia and Miguel ran ahead, still young enough to find some joy in throwing rocks into the water, despite everything that had happened. "I don't want to leave," Carmen said quietly. "This is our home, our life, everything we've built. I know, me neither. But if it's what keeps the kids safe, we'll figure it out," Diego promised. "Whatever decision we make it together." His phone rang. "Marcus, turn on the news," his neighbor said without preamble. "Channel 7. Diego found a bench and pulled up the news on his phone. The reporter was standing outside his house, the crime scene tape still visible behind her. Home invasion by suspected members of the Aryan Brotherhood was thwarted by the quick thinking of this family and their neighbor, a decorated Marine Corps veteran. Police say this incident is connected to a 20-year-old murder case that may soon be reopened. While authorities aren't releasing names, sources tell us that the homeowner is a former inmate who witnessed a prison killing and is now cooperating with investigators. "They didn't use our names," Carmen said, reading over his shoulder. "Not yet. But it's only a matter of time before someone figures it out." That night, back at the motel, Diego lay awake long after his family had fallen asleep. His phone buzzed with another text, this time from a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't open it, but curiosity won out. "You made a mistake. You and your family are dead. AB forever." Diego's blood ran cold. He should have expected this, should have known they'd find a way to contact him. He forwarded the message to Detective Chen, who called him 5 minutes later. "We're going to put a patrol car outside your motel," she said, "and I strongly suggest you consider that witness protection offer. This threat is credible." "How did they get my number?" "The AB has connections everywhere, Mr. Martinez. In prisons, on the outside, even in law enforcement. We're going to trace this, but I'm guessing it's a burner phone that's already been destroyed." After hanging up, Diego looked at his sleeping family. Sophia was curled up with her pillow, her face peaceful in sleep. Miguel had kicked off his blanket, and Carmen was gently covering him again, maternal instinct active even in slumber. These were the people he'd died to protect. And maybe, Diego realized, that's exactly what he'd have to be prepared to do. The days that followed were a strange mix of monotony and terror. They stayed at the motel, a patrol car parked conspicuously outside. Miguel missed his basketball tryouts, which broke Diego's heart. Sophia missed a week of school, falling behind in her classes. Carmen took a leave of absence from the hospital. And Diego, who'd spent 15 years building his reputation and his business, watched it all fall apart through no fault of his own. But there were bright spots too. Marcus visited daily, bringing food and conversation and a sense of normalcy. The neighborhood organized a fundraiser to help with their expenses. Someone started a GoFundMe that raised $8,000 in 3 days. Diego's co-workers at the garage took turns calling with encouragement and offers of help. And slowly, painfully, Diego realized something important. He wasn't alone. For all the years he'd spent trying to distance himself from his past, trying to be invisible and unremarkable, he'd actually built something worth fighting for, a community, a family, a life filled with people who cared. The preliminary hearing for Tommy Vixen's murder case was scheduled for 3 weeks after the home invasion. Diego would have to testify about what he'd witnessed in that prison laundry room, would have to face Vixen across a courtroom and tell the truth he'd kept hidden for 2 decades. The thought terrified him. But as the date approached, Diego found himself growing calmer, more resolved. "I'm doing the right thing," he told Carmen one evening as they sat outside the motel room watching the sunset. "For the first time in 20 years, I'm actually doing the right thing." "You've been doing the right thing for 15 years, Carmen corrected gently. "You've been an amazing father, a wonderful husband, a good man. Don't discount all of that." "But I was living a lie. I was pretending that murder didn't happen, that I didn't see it, that I could just forget and move on." "You were surviving. That's not the same as lying. Maybe she was right. Maybe there was a difference between survival and cowardice, between keeping silent out of fear and keeping silent out of complicity. Diego wasn't sure anymore, but he knew that going forward, he'd live with the truth, whatever consequences that brought. The night before the hearing, Diego barely slept. He rehearsed his testimony in his mind, going over every detail Detective Chen and Adia Wu had prepared him for. He thought about Vixen, wondered if the man would even remember him, wondered what it would feel like to finally speak the truth after so long. The courthouse was an imposing building downtown, all marble and authority. Diego wore the one suit he owned, bought for Carmen's father's funeral 5 years ago. Carmen held his hand as they walked up the steps, flanked by Detective Chen and 2 uniformed officers. Inside, the security was intense. Metal detectors, bag checks, guards everywhere. The AB's reach was long, and nobody was taking chances. The courtroom was smaller than Diego expected, more intimate. He sat in the witness waiting area with Carmen and the kids, watching other people come and go. Lawyers in expensive suits, court reporters with their stenography machines, jurors who looked bored or nervous or determined. And then Tommy Vixen was led in, wearing an orange jumpsuit and shackles, his face harder and older than Diego remembered, but still recognizable. Their eyes met across the hallway, and Vixen's expression changed from confusion to recognition, to rage in the space of a heartbeat. He lunged forward, held back by his guards, screaming, "You're dead! You hear me? You and everyone you love, you're dead!" The guards dragged him away, his threats echoing down the hallway, but Diego sat perfectly still, his heart pounding, but his resolve firm. This was what he'd been afraid of for 20 years. And now that it was here, now that the monster had a face and a voice, Diego found he was less scared than he'd expected, because monsters are always less frightening in the daylight than they are in nightmares. When his name was called, Diego stood and walked into the courtroom. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And then, for the next 2 hours, he did exactly that. He told the court about that afternoon in the laundry room, about folding sheets and trying to be invisible, about watching Tommy Vixen murder Marcus Williams in cold blood. He described the sharpened toothbrush, the blood, the way Williams had clutched at his throat and tried to call for help but couldn't because his windpipe was punctured. The defense attorney tried to rattle him, questioned his memory after 20 years, brought up his criminal record, suggested he was lying to get back at the AB for the home invasion. But Diego stayed calm, stayed truthful, and when it was over, Ada Wu told him he'd done well. The decision wouldn't come for weeks, maybe months. But Diego had done his part. He'd told the truth. And as they left the courthouse, walking past the cameras and reporters shouting questions, Diego felt something he hadn't felt in 2 decades. Freedom. Not the physical freedom of leaving prison, but the spiritual freedom of finally being honest about who he was and what he'd seen. The trial for the 3 men who'd invaded their home came next, and that was easier somehow. The evidence was overwhelming. Multiple witnesses, physical evidence, recorded threats, attempted murder charges that would put all 3 away for decades. Kyle Decker got 25 years. The skeletal man, whose name was Trevor Walsh, got 15. The muscular man, Marcus Brennan, got 20, and throughout it all, the Martinez family stayed together. They moved back into their house after the repairs were done. New front door, new window, fresh paint to cover the bullet hole. Diego installed a security system that would have been overkill anywhere else, but felt necessary here. Carmen went back to work at the hospital. Sophia and Miguel returned to school, though both started seeing the trauma counselor regularly. Life didn't go back to normal. Normal was gone, burned away in the violence of that September evening. But they found a new normal, one built on honesty and community and the understanding that they'd survived something terrible together and come out stronger for it. Diego stood in his garage on a cold morning in December, 3 months after the invasion, and looked at the work orders piling up. Business had actually improved after the news stories. People wanted to support the family that had stood up to the AB, that had fought back and won. He'd hired an extra mechanic to keep up with demand. His phone buzzed. Detective Chen. "Got some news for you. The DNA evidence came back on the Williams case. Combined with your testimony, the DA is moving forward with murder charges. Vixen's going down." "Good," Diego said simply. "There's more. The FBI wants to talk to you. Some of what you said in your testimony connected to other cases they're investigating. You might be called to testify again." Diego took a deep breath. A year ago, even 3 months ago, that news would have terrified him. Now it just felt like the next step in a journey he'd already committed to. "Tell them I'm available," he said. That evening, the Martinez family sat around their repaired dining table, eating Carmen's enchiladas. Miguel had made the basketball team, not as point guard, but as a solid backup, which he was excited about anyway. Sophia had been accepted to UC Riverside for early admission. Carmen had been promoted to head nurse in her department, and Diego's garage was thriving. They talked and laughed and passed plates around just like they had that September evening. But there were differences too. They appreciated each moment more, understood how fragile safety could be, how quickly violence could shatter peace. They also knew they were stronger than they'd thought, braver than they'd believed, more resilient than they'd imagined. After dinner, Diego stood on his front porch and looked at his neighborhood. Lights glowed in windows up and down the street. Mrs. Chen was walking her dog. The Rodriguez kids were playing basketball in their driveway despite the cold. Marcus waved from his garage, where he was working on another piece of furniture. This was home. This was worth fighting for. And Diego had finally learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't running from your past or hiding from it. It's standing still and facing it head-on, telling the truth no matter the cost, and trusting that the people who love you will stand beside you when the darkness comes knocking. The Aryan Brotherhood had crashed their family dinner thinking they'd found easy targets, thinking fear and violence would silence a witness. Instead, they'd awakened something fiercer. A family's determination to protect each other, a community's refusal to let hate win, and one man's decision to finally stop running from his past and start building a future worth living. The men who'd burst through that door were now behind bars where they belonged. The murder Diego had witnessed was finally being prosecuted. And the Martinez family, battered but unbroken, was still together, still loving each other, still fighting for the life they'd built. Sometimes the monsters don't win. Sometimes the good people stand up and fight back. And sometimes a quiet Sunday dinner interrupted by violence becomes the moment when everything changes, not for the worse, as fear would suggest, but for the better, as courage demands.